So in academia, we're really good at doing these studies and then not thinking about why it's important to the rest of the world. So it's really important for us to do this. This was my exercise in trying to do this with our results. But I'm actually very interested in your feedback as well on some of this and how you might see it applies to your work or your practice. So what we learned in injury prevention, we're kind of, sometimes we don't do a very good job of understanding where people are coming from when we design our messaging. So we need to understand and recognize how fathers are thinking about safety so that we can work with that in order to actually promote safety. And this quote, I'll just let you read it. So this quote, I mean, they're not thinking about safety as the predominant thing. Really, the number one priority for them is to let their kids have new experiences. Of course, all of that overshadowed by making sure that it's not a serious injury. But we can still work with this. This is not against injury prevention. We need to acknowledge that the fathers do want to give their kids new experiences and recognize that they actually do go through quite a complex decision-making process in thinking about and allowing their kids to have experiences. We also need to avoid appearing like the safety police, where we're trying to prevent everything. We're not trying to prevent everything. And we're not trying to prevent kids from having new experiences, that we're actually just trying to get kids to be able to do new things in a safe way so that they don't end up dead or seriously injured. That's all we're trying to do. And I think fathers would agree that that's their goal as well. Having said that, it's also making people understand that injuries are a major killer. If their kids are likely to die from anything, it's going to be from an injury. And so it's really important for them to understand that it's not just a taken for granted, my kid is safe in every situation. In terms of the kind of material that we provide them, so they want a one-stop shop website. This is one example, there's many, but this is one example, safekidscanada.ca, which they have every possible unintentional, and when I say unintentional, I mean like what people call accidents, those kinds of injury prevention information on there. With intentional injuries such as child abuse, suicide, self-harm, that is another issue, and we can discuss that later if you like. But the important thing with your fathers is if they're interested in this, that you actually go online first, try and find some good websites and recommend those to them. You know, they were really strong about the fact that it had to be visual and concise material, so whatever you do offer should be like that. And Safe Kids Canada, other groups have tried to do that, and we're working with them to do that even more. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I really want to hear your feedback on this and what I can do to help you as well. So I don't know if you heard the question, but it was, did we look at how fathers were learning about safety? Is that?
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Were there people in their environment that were influential?
Right, yeah. We asked them about whether there were resources in their community that helped or hindered those efforts. So it wasn't so much about learning. Well, we asked them, do you look for material? And while we didn't ask them that question, I think it did come out strongly in other ways. So for example, their wives were seen as a big source of information, and actually a lot of them said, well, I don't look for information, my wife does. Or they split it up in terms of I look for this, she looks for that. So for example, there was one father who thought that bike helmets weren't actually effective. He was from Holland. Nobody wears helmets there. And so his wife actually spent quite a bit of time on the internet looking for material to convince him that bike helmets were a good thing. But they also talked about just at playgroups, at the playground or whatever, talking to other parents, just raising issues and that sort of thing. And their own parents came up, but not that frequently. In fact, their own parents came up more as a hindrance than anything in terms of having dangerous houses. So when they went to visit Grandma and Grandpa, that the house wasn't safe or childproof, or so. In fact, one one case, the child had been quite injured at grandma's house. So not directly looking at what you're looking at, but yeah.
My hunch in asking the question was their partners would be the source of most of their tutorial about safety.
Yeah, and definitely that's that's a theme that was emerging as we were looking at the data for sure. Yeah.
Mariana, just wondering, just looking at information sources, what I wrote down as you were speaking was workplace. My husband is very safety conscious in his workplace, and that's part of what's expected. And that seems like a really great avenue that's probably not being used.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting because about the workplace issue, people are safety conscious in their workplaces, but let's say they're taught how to lift things safely or go on ladders safely, but then they go home and they put on the Christmas lights and they don't follow any of those strategies. So it's like, okay, well, you're doing things well there and you're not here. What's the difference? But yeah, you're right. Workplace is a good place to put it, and also to take that messaging home with them. Yeah.
Did you ever look at the dad's interests in terms of, say, sporting events or things like that, in terms of how much they let their child do? Because I know, like in my family situation, my husband is an avid mountain bike rider and jumps bikes and stuff, and my son jumps bikes and does the flips and all the kind of stuff, which I can't watch. I mean, he's very safety conscious in terms of telling him where all the equipment, etc.
Yeah.
But it's way over my comfort level.
Right.
But because, and he's very safety oriented and everything else, but because that's his area of interest and kind of he thinks expertise, it's okay for my son to do that.
Right. And actually that came up both for wives and husbands, from the partner's perspective, that in some cases it's like people had a blind spot for, well, that's the wrong word. It's not necessarily that they shouldn't be doing those things as long as they're doing them safely. But for example, there was one guy whose wife did skydiving, hang gliding, rock climbing, like a few kind of more extreme sports, and wanted her kids to go that route, and the dad was like, I'm just not so comfortable with that, you know. But then he had other sports that he did that his wife actually wasn't as comfortable with. But yeah, actually, the fathers described all sorts of things, all of those kinds of activities and rock climbing and so on, that they would let their kids do. And we also had, you know, fathers who said, I wouldn't let my kid do hockey, that's too dangerous, you know. So we really, I think we actually did a good job of representing the spectrum of kind of risk tolerance amongst fathers with our sample. Yeah.
When I was asking about the injuries between men or boys and girls, from the dad aspect, because I think our house is reversed like that too. But I grew up, I think it came back historically from our parents, because my husband grew up in a very close-knit, controlled type environment where I grew up with all boys and a dad. So ours was experience life, try lives, but that door was open for communication or whatever needed to be there, and safety was in there.
Right.
So, but society does it so differently too, because when you're looking at different accidents, we laugh all the time at American Funniest Videos.
Yeah.
If you ever watch that show, the only thing that you ever see girls hurt in is wedding photos or videos. The rest of it's all men or boys who are trying tricks or going outside of their risk factors and stuff. So I think society sometimes sets it up that boys should be more experimental risk takers than girls should be in the kitchen.
For sure. And in fact, there is research on that, and we are doing analysis on masculinity and the impact of masculinity and gender socialization on this group. I didn't report it because we're actually right in the thick of it and in the middle. But for sure, many of the things that you talked about in terms of the expectations for boys to behave in certain ways, and fathers not stepping in as early for boys when they're in risky situations, having higher expectations for them to do things and so on. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You talked about the dad who was originally from Holland, so I just was wondering, in your findings, especially the multicultural nature, you know, Canada, like the neighborhood I work in is 38 cultures, right? So what to me would be the impact of views from your culture of origin that would affect the way that you parented or the way you viewed safety, whether boys, girls, and all of that. To me, that would be a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
How that might affect you, how you might access information too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because if you were brought up, well, that's, you know, sort of clear that, you know, kids should experience this and not experience that. So it'd be interesting to see that reflected in the research.
Yeah, for sure. And our sample was, as I said, 63% born in Canada. So we did have actually one father who had moved to Canada 3 weeks before we talked to him from China. So that was pretty cool. We did have, you know, other types of cultural groups. We haven't done those analyses yet, and we want to actually expand our research to be more inclusive and make more of an effort to capture some multicultural aspects, and I think that it would have an impact on all those things. I agree with you. Yeah, yeah. There was a question here. Yeah.
We have entire generations of children raising children,
right,
who have been impacted generationally and don't have the skills that this particular piece of research appears to target a specific group of people. So it would be real interesting to see what the data would reflect in cases of fathers who haven't learned any of these skills, that they themselves don't even know the questions to ask to find out about these things. And many of us are working in those populations, you know, and supporting the challenges that these young parents are faced with on a daily basis, and they don't have the luxury of a lot of the access to, you know, the things that's being talked about today in general, period. You know, so they're very limited, not only in their ability to access this kind of these kinds of resources you're referring to, but the fact that they don't have any role model or type of direction of how to be a parent when they're like a child themselves. So that would be very interesting to see what that would look like.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we actually tried to make a special effort towards the end of our data collection to get more younger fathers, because the mean age was 39. We're not talking, they're not that young. And we weren't, it was towards the end, so we weren't successful with that. But this is a foundational study. It's kind of our first study. And so what it's doing is teaching us where we're at and where the gaps are. Things like that, so that we can apply for more funding to be able to do exactly that. And in fact, we have a grant that's under review right now to look at Aboriginal fathers and be able to do some of this work with Aboriginal fathers, recognizing that the way that this was structured is not appropriate at all for Aboriginal communities, and that it needs to be completely and utterly revamped if we're going to be looking at this issue for them. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Another thing we also see too is a lot of stuff done in Vancouver, but the greater BC, like northern BC, I think a lot of recreational or safety issues in the north sometimes are a lot different, or any question that you ask in research is different in the northern or rural areas compared to urban areas.
I'm so glad you said that, because we have another grant we're waiting to hear actually next week that actually will focus on rural areas, comparing with rural areas, so that we can get a better sense of what's going on. They won't have the, you know, they're spread out. There are different kind of dangers in the environment, potentially kids working on the farm or whatever the case may be, on ATVs, which are incredibly dangerous things, and so on, as well as the issues of different ideas around parenting and masculinity and what it means to be a boy or a man in rural areas. And so pray for us next week. We could get the word that that's been funded, and then we'll come to bug you to get some participants.
Mariana, I wonder if in your literature, and if you're aware, or in your research, and if you're aware in the literature, and others as well, I'm always struck, particularly in academic settings, the lack of the use of the word love. And I say to academics all the time, what are we afraid of? Like, why don't we use that? And I think also in terms of the literature then that goes out to dads or that's on websites. I mean, as you were talking, one thing that struck me was Karen, my wife, doesn't just provide me with information, she provides me with feedback. Right? So, I mean, with all this injury stuff, right, I'm very aware when I've stepped over an acceptable boundary that's kind of negotiated in some ways between Karen and I and between my kids. But our discussion is really about, so how do each of us understand what it means to love our kids? Now, men aren't encouraged to think that way, right? And so when you're doing injury prevention stuff, I'm kind of wondering, even as you're interviewing the dads, if they get the sense that you're asking them, do you really love your kids, right? What are you willing to risk? And so what's the problem here?
Right, yeah.
And then even in the literature, versus a dad being very aware that he loves his kids.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why he does it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a different attitude.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if that comes out not only in your research, but if you're aware of that language of relationship and intimacy and love in the literature.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it actually, and it's important to look at. And we had to really be careful how we asked our questions because we didn't want to ask them in a judgmental way. So, are you putting your kids at risk? You know, like that's, and we don't even want to. We don't believe that risk taking is a bad thing. We also agree that children have the potential to learn some amazing things from taking risks. So we actually changed our questions 3 times throughout the course of the study to try and take into account kind of the sensitivities around the way we were asking and whether we were kind of maybe being perceived as judgmental and potentially attacking, like, okay, we're injury prevention people and we're here to judge you on what you're doing with your kids, like just being really careful about avoiding that issue. But in terms of, you know, the negotiation of risk and in the family and so on, that's certainly something that we're exploring a bit further in our data because it did come out. And in one of my other presentations, I have this quote that's just beautiful because it talks about a dad who's actually realized his wife. He talks about how his wife, sometimes when their kid is hurt or cut or whatever, saying, okay, you know what, this is not a teaching moment. You need to cuddle your kid and then you can talk about teaching him, you know, what he did wrong. So that was a really, actually a good illustration of the wife giving feedback to the husband about this is not appropriate, do this first. And him appreciating that feedback and actually learning from it. My pleasure. And just, yeah, take my contact info down because I'd love to hear from you or any questions you might have or about any of this would be fantastic. Thank you.